Founded in 1996, Fosway Group offers in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning practices. We provide analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates, as well as independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. Now, before we launch into the main body, let me take this moment to tell you about Fosway Corporate Membership. This is a private network for corporate HR, learning and talent leaders, offering deeper access to data and insights behind the 9 grids and realities research. Monthly virtual roundtables on key topics, private analyst time, accelerated buying support, and much more. Please do contact us if you're interested in learning more about that. So this year's research shows that the overall learning system market is growing, but economic uncertainties and complexity remain, with vendors balancing the need for financial efficiency and also the need to innovate their solutions, especially, of course, to invest in AI. So to talk about this today, I'm delighted to welcome lead analyst on this research, Fiona Leteney, as well as Fosway CEO and founder David Wilson, to discuss and dissect all the findings in this latest iteration of the 9 grid for learning systems. A couple of housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A at the end. Ask questions throughout. I'll gather them up and ask them as chronologically accurate as possibly I can at the end in an extensive Q&A section. But first of all, we're going to get into a bit of an explainer about the 9 grid and the process. So David, let's set the scene. It's over to you.
Hi, and thanks everybody from me too. So always feels that this comes around very quickly. And as Fiona said, it's a sort of end of a mountain of work. So pleased to be able to kind of talk with some of you today and maybe answer some of your questions. Before we go into the main 9 grid, there's a few slides we go through just to kind of position it. So apologies if you've heard these before, but it is really, really important because it's amazing. Just even looking at some of the chat response around some of this 9 grid, there is quite a lot of confusion around how you get on it, how you get considered, is it pay for play or any of those kind of things. So as Fiona said, there's a kind of huge exercise that goes on each year to redo the research. We zero base the research each year. We have new functional models can capture. We have new customer reference process, etc. Obviously, we build on lots of existing insight and relationships with those, but we also are spending a lot of time trying to gather all the different perspectives, not least from corporate customers, particularly from our corporate research network members, from the roundtables that we run each year, both physical and in-person ones and also virtual. We also do a lot of private corporate inquiry work and provide analyst input to a number of corporates that are trying to make decisions around buying decisions around the market or who to look at, which vendors, etc., and so on. So it gives us a really large body of input. On top of that, we then run a structured public research process, and we also run a kind of deep process with each of the vendors. The submission process is fairly onerous, or that's what they tell us anyway. We do obviously independent briefings with all of those demonstrations and so on, and then another round of customer referencing from that exercise as well. So it's a very, very comprehensive approach. We're also running, of course, in each of the 5 segments that Fosway covers. Learning systems being one of the oldest sector segments, the longest long-term ones, and the 9 grid. I think we're in like a 14th iteration or something, 13th, 14th iteration of it or something like that. So it's been around, but it's evolved a lot if you actually track them historically. One of the key questions is around who gets to appear on a 9 grid. So first of all, the 9 grid itself is a subset of all the organizations we're tracking in each of the segments. There's probably at least double the number of organizations that kind of overall we're engaging with or participating around or tracking in the background, sometimes passively despite them, sometimes actively with them. But the basic criteria for who gets to be included in the 9 grid is effectively the main vendor options that are in active use or in active consideration within our kind of target audience, which is typically enterprise organizations, often private sector organizations, maybe EMEA headquartered or EMEA in a global and sometimes, and of course, global firms as well. So we're looking at the criteria is based on effectively from all of that exercise, who are the vendors basically that are appearing in that process. We also, of course, are continue trying to track what we would call innovator companies and, who are the ones with the potential to have to be either in use or in consideration in that kind of target audience. There is no pay for play. It's not possible to buy your way onto a 9 grid. It's also not possible to buy your way off of a 9 grid. So, a vendor can't choose not to be included. It's purely an analyst decision. And the integrity around that is very, very strong. So, if you see comments around that, it's just not true. You have to go through the kind of process. Although there's a huge vendor side process to this with briefings and functional capture, and now also AI related capture and everything else, which we'll come back and talk about a bit later on. The primary analysis viewpoint is what customers say. So you can have vendors, and this is if you've tracked the 9 grids in the past, you'll know this is definitely true. Which have a high presence in the market and maybe really quite successful at winning, but if their customers don't like them, they're not going to be a strategic leader. So you've got to really think around that. The customer viewpoint is really paramount. And in particular, when we're looking at performance, we're not just looking at who's competing and who's winning. We're also looking at what's the customer advocacy picture like. And you'll see sometimes vendors move maybe left within a zone, or you'll see them even move back zones where there's a kind of loss of momentum, or there's a level of customer dissatisfaction. Again, it's very, very important part of the model. So we've a huge amount of information. This is the 9 grid image, of course, and even 9 grid report is just the tip of a very large iceberg that is, as I said, zero-based and recalculated every year. So on that basis, don't just look at the image. Please read and download and read the reports, the market and solution trends, some of which we're going to talk about today. Fiona's going to talk through, are hugely important in shaping the way that we see the market and how that market is evolving, but also it shapes the way we're looking at the vendors. So when you're looking at vendor potential, obviously we're also looking at the potential of vendors to support those newer capabilities in the market and the trends and things, what are emerging as the most important stuff. So definitely download and read it. Also read the second half of the report that tells you what the methodology and the analysis methodology, what the different terms mean, like performance and potential and trajectory and so on. Each one of those reports, although there's a standard operating model around it, is customized specifically for the segment that we're covering. So yeah, please read that. So Fiona, do you want to talk us through the model for this year and then the 9 grid?
Sure. So here we have the functional model that is this year's model. It can be tweaked and changed each year, and it has been this year. I'll come back to that in a minute. But actually from, I think it was 2020, we did quite a big piece of research, and it was when people were starting to talk about LXPs, and we changed our terminology to suites and specialists. And that's when we came up with these 5 pillars that then have, and now it's actually 5 subsections to each of them. One of those, it's the workplace learning one. We added a subsection into that one this year because it was actually through when we were doing the AI research that things sort of came out that we thought, actually, there's a piece missing here, and it was about performance support and optimization. And so we decided we wanted to bring together some of the features, under that particular subheading. And as David said, this is it's quite an onerous data capture process. And so under each of these subsections, there are in totality over 500 questions. So that is what the vendors need to go through each year. So if we move on to the 9 grid, and as David was saying, it's not just about the image. We'll come back to the image in a minute. I've picked out 1 or 2 of the headlines that are from the report, and we do every 9 grid has the top headline that involves the economic situation, because that is I mean, and particularly at the moment, it's not just the economics, it's the political climate, and things are uncertain and even unstable at this moment in time. That said, learning systems market is still growing. And so from my perspective, that's quite, positive. There are lots of things going on. There's lots of mergers and acquisitions that I think is going to continue into the future as well. But generally speaking, the market itself is growing. This next heading that I put there, the LXP is dead, finally. But actually, the way that we put that into the report is that LXP is dead, long live learning experience. And that is the crucial point. Learning experience is absolutely not dead. It is absolutely what all the buyers want, but it is not a buying category. It is not down to a couple of vendors that consider themselves to deliver learning experience. Every vendor, every learning system needs to be responsible for good learning experience, and therefore we and even the reason why we can call out that is finally dead is that actually this is what the vendors are telling us from two aspects. One is that they no longer want to be known as an LXP, but also they're not necessarily getting asked for an LXP. I think it's still out there a little bit, but as I say, learning experience is not down to just one or two of the vendors. So frontline, time to wake up, and I'm talking to the whole of the industry here, in that it's mentioned a few times in the report, but we have over the last 26 years that I've been in the industry have ignored a section, a very large proportion of learners who are deskless, that they are frontline in a lot of cases, and it is a significantly important part of an organization from all sorts of angles, and we don't do this well. And a lot of some of the vendors are beginning to pick this up, but we are hearing from buyers very much that are in manufacturing organizations that need solutions that are out of the box, it's not just moving something from a laptop access onto mobile. We need to think a little bit more out of the box from that perspective. The next headline, AI is being disruptive, and there is in so much to say on this, and yet we don't have time to say it, but we have got a whole different piece of research that we're going through the second year of this research. And what I can say is that whereas last year it was quite obvious that there was a lot of hype, and there was a lot of, you'd expect from what you saw at the likes of Learning Technologies London, that everybody was native in the AI, and that wasn't actually transferring into what was available live. Now that is becoming more the case. However, there is still a big question over adoption and the value of that AI, that we are doing some more research on that. But that is becoming quite, there's a likelihood to be quite disruptive. Interesting to say, a convergence of the 9 grid. I remember 10 years ago when I joined Fosway, we had a bespoke learning content grid. We had an authoring grid that was, in my time here, has never actually been updated. It wasn't deemed to be strategic enough, as well as the learning systems grid. And what we're seeing is quite a lot of most of the learning systems vendors are either adding libraries or authoring into the learning systems, and therefore they are converging within that. The expectation, particularly of new buyers, that it's first-time buyers, they want to see a full learning system, not an empty learning system, and so that is an interesting trend. And here we have a new three-letter acronym, the MCP. So the model, context, protocol, and what on earth does that mean? But it's actually really quite fascinating. And I think the fact that this is the way that we're going to have business applications being able to speak through agentic AI to learning systems or learning applications, and therefore share data and therefore potentially measure impact is looking at the positive side, and very much I thought, Dave, we talked about this at an event yesterday, and I was saying, oh yeah, this is going to sort out the industry for in the years to come. And David's saying maybe that's a bit delusional, not just rose tinted glasses, but I think it is a very significant thing that's happening in the market just at the moment. So what about the grid? So what we have are 48 vendors on the grid. There are 34 of those are suites, 14 are specialists. 2 are removed from last year and 2 have been added. And so first of all, I'd just like to say there were a couple of significant moves. So Docebo have moved from strategic challenger into strategic leader. And Absorb have moved from core leader up into strategic challenger. And so those are, as I say, significant from the point of view of there is a need for a number of the vendors to have stepped up into that large enterprise area so that they can compete with the likes of Cornerstone, and in the RFPs, and they are sophisticated enough to deliver across a complex organization. What we've also got, I mentioned that we're 2 new ones onto the grid, and Blossom is there in the potential challenger and Attrivity in the potential performer. And just to again iterate really some of David's introduction in terms of those, they've both been on our radar for a couple of years. Blossom probably even more than that. Blossom being headquartered in Israel, but you'll have seen potentially if you've been at the Learning Technologies London, they're having a stand there for the last 2 or 3 years. Even at World of Learning, they're there too, and so they have been gradually building up their brand awareness, if you like, with certainly in the UK. So be outside. They're quite a large organization in Israel already. And then there's also Attrivity, which is a specialist, and they are from Spain, and they're doing some interesting, innovative things. So look out for them as well. So, David, do you want me to? Do you want to add to any of what I've just said, or we can get on to further?
She says with some dread, because I always have a habit of doing that. I think a couple of comments. First of all, I think the convergence of the 9 grids is actually not convergence of 9 grids, it's convergence of the segments, right? So that's the way things. So the distinction between and obviously we will soon be talking about our digital learning 9 grid as well, and we've got many of the digital learning vendors, which is part of the pressure that particularly AI is exerting on their content business or trying to become platform businesses. The distinction between the learning systems 9 grid and digital learning has always been fairly clear. In other words, learning systems is about companies that are basically primarily selling a platform, and the digital learning one was about companies that were selling content or content services, related services, or learning related services. Now digital learning related services, but there's always been some overlap, and I think as more of the systems vendors add authoring capability, and obviously AI has accelerated that, as more of them add content libraries and things, that obviously does make a difference. Somebody put on, what is, around the MCP thing. Obviously, I think the key thing about MCP, and we're already seeing this with many of the vendors, viewing it as pretty much the de facto mechanism for agentic coordination between applications. And and agents and so on and things like this. So if you're not aware of it, it's worth looking at that, because this is an architectural view, I think, of the way AI is going to impact the systems architecture. And it's super interesting as well, because it's also the way in which these systems will connect into the wider workplace and workplace apps and everything else like this. So I think that's something that's worth looking at. The move of Dechabo into strategic leader is, it's one of those things that we've been looking at tracking for a while. To be honest, we didn't do it because previously, because whilst Dechabo was making really good progress and growth overall, where in the past, a lot of their large enterprise business was customer and partner training. And they've been on a really big journey to be able to step up, to be able to do whole enterprise. And at the end of the day, to be a strategic leader, you either need to be a specialist or you need to be doing the whole enterprise thing. But obviously, in a market where Cornerstone has, acquired, if you like, its natural competitors historically with Saba and SumTotal, became the sort of almost the dominant, player in that market. Most of its strategic competition, as we know, we've talked about before, has been with the HCM vendors, with Workday Learning and with SAP particularly on the learning side. It really felt it was the right time to recognize the change and to move Dechabo across. And obviously, the other one that we did is we moved Absorb, which is also now, north of $100 million or whatever it is, and really chasing fast, really, to step into that gulf. And it felt, and this is a normal transition, actually. A lot of companies that are core leaders that are really trying to stretch up into large enterprise will go probably in strategic challenger first, and then prove that they can really win consistently and deliver consistently, because that's a huge step up. It's not a linear increase. I often talk about it as an exponential, a 10x jump in terms of the complexity of the customer, dealing with obviously SI ecosystems, systems integrators and everything else like that. So there's some big changes there. I think also what's interesting, we've seen somebody like a Skillsoft, or some example, which is obviously historically mainly been a content company, but always had a platform offer, really starting to focus very heavily on almost being platform led and content supported rather than necessarily the other way around, which is also going to, also create some other changes. And then also trajectory, so if, some of the smaller boutique players, but someone like a How Now in the UK, again, with a really kind of what we would call it an excelling trajectory within core challengers, so really pushing right. Another big one has been the rise of Sana, now acquired also by Workday, of course. But the Sana assessment, when you look at the trajectory of Sana itself, even prior to this, the Workday acquisition, that's going to be that's interesting. And obviously, longer term, we'll then need to look at whether we ultimately merge those or whether we may keep those separately. Sana is still available as a separate solution, but obviously, we would expect Workday to be frantically also cross-selling it into Workday Learning customers as well, as a sort of an add-on thing, as they're doing with some of the other segments as well. So yeah, there's lots and lots of stuff going on in the market. The other comment, just go back to the top one, the economic climate. I mean, I think that's obviously got even worse since we originally drafted and wrote the report, right? So, given what's happening in the Middle East and so on at the moment, that creates lots of uncertainties around things. And, we've seen, we track the vendors quite closely across the whole year cycle, as well as customer decisions. And it was quite clear that to some degrees, the uncertainty was causing customers to defer decisions. But they can only defer them for so long, then they need to act, and so on. Oh, the final other comment I wanted to make, sorry, because I think it's quite important, is on the Cornerstone level, generally, when you look at our market and solution trends sections, particularly market trends, we don't comment about specific vendors within that. But we made an exception this time because Cornerstone, at the end of last year, announced to the customer basically that they were going to end of life Saba and SumTotal at the end of 2027. So there was a kind of 2-year horizon around it, but obviously there are still quite a fair number of those customers who had chosen not yet to might be migrate across or have very good reasons why they can't. Some of those are actually very old, incredibly well established customers where those systems are deeply integrated into a wider application ecosystem within those businesses, particularly in things like pharma and life sciences and some other areas. Making those changes, and that's actually created. We've talked a little bit around the vacuum in the larger enterprise market space, and I think that vacuum has kind of, to some degree, become very explicit, and that's also another factor, I think, which is sucking in creating the opportunity for some of those strategic challenges to step in there as well. So, I mean, there's a bit more than I normally would kind of comment on. Let's pass back to you and start to, John, go through some of the questions.
Sure thing. I'm going to take these first in reverse order. So there's a question from Richard. Fiona, when do you think we'll have an organization on here that is not a learning native and maybe a Claude or GPT plugin? I guess he's trying to ask a question about whether there will be an overlap with LLMs moving more permanently into the learning space or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it talks about the kind of where we see the whole learning systems market in 5 years' time. I think there are certain of the vendors who are currently looking at, right, what happens when learning systems and the functionality of a learning system is going to change significantly, be changed by AI. And they're already creating, in fact, one of them has already launched, and they launched in Paris. So that's Rise Up and Forge Learning. And that's very specifically, it's not a learning system, whether it eventually goes on a learning systems grid, and what would a learning systems grid look like anyway in 3 to 5 years' time. And we will, as we always do, review, because as the goalposts change in the market, then we will change the goalposts around the particular grids. David talked about digital learning. Well, it wasn't known as digital learning back 10 years ago. It was bespoke content, I think, then. But that changed because the market was changing, and so that grid changed. I'm not sure whether that completely answers the question, but my crystal ball is still a tad cloudy in terms of where that's going.
I think in reality, there are already vendors here who's not primarily learning companies, right? So some of those are HR businesses which have got into learning, but you've also got Microsoft in there, which, is not really there for that reason at all. It's more because, originally the role with Viva and Viva Learning is how that was playing a part of almost architecturally around which learning was going to engage within the workplace applications and so on, and the ability to influence the market. And it's still a factor. It just hasn't, I think, really fundamentally changed. But obviously, arguably, the Microsoft AI capability with Copilot and everything else might have an even bigger impact. But there's also a debate, frankly, about how much Microsoft really cares about learning specifically within that. It's a bit of a rounding error, especially when you look at the total amount of AI investment that some of these vendors are making. I think where it's interesting is at what point do we start to see the kind of horizontal, particularly AI platforms or the transversal platforms, workplace applications with AI, remove the need for companies to have learning systems at all, which is a debate. There's a point within the report that touches on that a little bit. And I think the jury is definitely out around that in terms of, if you don't have the application data, how do you make inference and provide specific insight when you don't actually know what activity is going on or any of the kind of things within the learning process or workflow. So there is, I think it's a direction we're tracking closely. I would argue, I know I have a vested interest in that position as the founder of CEO of Fosway, but I think we've led the market in terms of actually the way we've talked about a lot of these things. We many years ago were talking about next generation learning environments that were different to LMSs historically. We started to look at the LXP, and if you go back even 5 years ago, I think you'll find that whereas a number of the US analysts and so on were very much like bigging up how LXP was going to change or replace a lot of things, and the reality is none of that's true. None of that's come true. And I think there's a question around LXP, but part of the thing here is a learning experience platform as a separate platform, separate to things that were actually managing the learning process, and the LMSs and stuff and things like this, was always a transitional need. Typically, for a large, complex customer, it was too hard to fix the learning experience of their learning or training management systems. But the problem is nobody below those large enterprise customers could afford them, and or to afford to have multiple platforms that then integrate together. So ultimately, that we always saw that as a likely convergence. And then obviously, as Fiona said, I think in 2020 we started talking about learning suites and learning specialists, where people could, where some companies would solve part of the problem, but typically be plugged into a learning suite or an HR suite with a learning component in it that would then address, the rest of the problem. And obviously the way in which if you look at our functional model, it's evolved massively over that time, and the amount of, for example, AI that we've had embedded in the functional model over for a number of years is really, really high. Trying to track when it was going to become real in terms of the market and so on. So there are lots of changes around it, and I think there is a potential for companies to push more of that responsibility into the AI tools. But ultimately, how they build an ecosystem around that and make that work is still, and at the end of the day, none of your organization, I'm sure, can still not be compliant or manage their compliance agenda, even though we may have that relatively well dialed in most companies. We can't turn that stuff off as well. So we still have to reconcile all of the needs together. So, but we'll see, every year is a new year, and we continue to track it and evolve it. And also, obviously, as we do during the year, leading to the next cycle. So, interesting.
Thank you, David. We're just going to go back to LXPs briefly, Fiona. Sabina has asked, what do you mean by the LXP being dead? Could you explain again or provide a bit more info?
Yeah, so as David was saying, the reason for the LXP, if you go back probably to 2020, 2019, whenever they kind of appeared, was a kind of almost and I think actually, to take an example, somebody like Fuse was one of the first that kind of called out as being an LXP. And it was that they did things differently. Their learning experience was different to the traditional legacy type learning systems, learning management systems. And the learning management systems had not a good reputation for the kind of look and feel and the how easy it was to navigate, etc. And so there were a number of what we were calling next gen learning environments back then. We were calling those out and seeing that they were coming in from left field, if you like, to actually satisfy a particular need. Now, then what happened is some people, some organizations took on Fuse as an example, but others as well, and then said, oh, yeah, but what about our compliance functionality? Oh, well, we don't do that. And they had assumed that that was already a given. But it wasn't. And so this is where we came in with that specialist and suite categories. The suites are the ones that will do end to end. They will do the compliance and right the way through with all the functionality to a greater or lesser extent. The depth of it and the sophistication of it is then that suite where it is, whether it's on the first tier, mid tier, or the high tier of the grid. But then the specialists, again, David mentioned this, would come in with a particular thing that they did. We had, now it's on the grid this time as Loom apps, but Teach on Mars was mobile specific mobile native. But again, we did what is experience and what learning experience anyway. And when we did that research, we came up with a number of different specialisms that could be considered as learning experience. What then happened was that mid-tier, again, David did mention this, but that mid-tier, the buyers cannot afford two systems. They can only justify one system. And therefore, all those that were focusing on that mid-tier market were backfilling with learning technology, the learning management technology. And so they moved from being the specialists into the suites. And so less and less they were being considered as an LXP. And there's a number on the grid, and I mean, even we had, again, using Fuse as an example, because they a couple of years ago talked about the fact that they were both being looked at as a suite, but also as a specialist. But now they're saying, no, we don't get asked to be an LXP anymore. So we see that category going. Sorry, that was a bit too long an answer, but
if a bit of historical adjustment, I'm sure Steve Deneen at Fuse would love you giving him credit for being the first LXP. But the reality is, of course, the original LXPs, Degreed, Edcast, Pathgather, so being less UK parochial and a bit more global. And obviously in the very early days, there was a kind of very recognizable need, aggregating learning from all sources, not just from your LMS, providing a single point of access, probably then providing, a search and then optimizing the experience. You could make intelligent recommendations and all those kind of the standard things that an LXP did. The reality is every learning system needs to do that and always did. But it was very hard to fix that in a large enterprise context when you've got your LMS is a super tanker probably running at that kind of speed as well. That's probably not a good analogy in the current world, is it? Because most of them are stationary somewhere. But anyway, but the reality was it was really hard to fix. When you've got multiple big LMS implementations to make them a point of experience. We moved the goalpost on what we expected. From a learning system, we thoroughly worried about whether the learner liked them, right? Whereas in the past we didn't. We just worried about whether they could book on the training and whether we could prove that they'd done it or not. And that transition which happened in the market probably 10, 15 years ago, but that the LXP is a separate segment. And we hear this all the time from vendors, right? Especially when they're trying to differentiate from each other and things. They come out, we're going to create a new segment. And almost none of them ever do that. But they do sometimes find a window of opportunity which they can ride, and that's what the original LXPs did. Ultimately, they ended up sort of eating each other or being eaten. Edcast was bought by Cornerstone. I think Degreed bought Pathgather really early on, if anybody's old enough to remember Pathgather. There are other platforms that then took a positioning around it, but they were never really an LXP. Fuse was never really an LXP. It was a social learning platform, really, that also addressed that kind of need around knowledge transfer and so on. And you had other things. Valamis, for example, positioned itself as that, but in reality, it wasn't. It was still more of a learning system, trying to address more of the functional model. And as Fiona said, and I said earlier, in the mid-market, nobody can afford to buy multiple ones. And more importantly, they certainly can't afford to keep integrating them all together, right? That's hideously expensive. So, we were always going to end up converging on a situation where there was one solution there. Or if an all-in. And then if you have a specialist, you can still do that. You can still have a specialist for maybe specific skills related development or around training orchestra, which we haven't touched on, obviously, but continually sits in that strategic leader area because they really do own that space around training management in large scale organizations and the complexity and the financials and the resource management and the things around that. They almost have a unique capability. They end up partnering. Going back many years, that was a conversation. The things is, stop thinking about themselves as competing in LMS and think about partnering with them, because most of the LMSs don't do that stuff. Degreed has done a good job with partnering with companies like Workday and SAP to provide an additional capability on top of some of the core learning where they don't really can't really address it. So that's where the specialists play, right? They partner and typically fit around the edges and do specific things, which is why when you look at the report, we talk about what their specialisms are. But yeah, there is no segment, there is no separate buying segment for LXP anymore. It just does not exist. And the reference leaders around that, and in particular companies like Big Read, etc., will have absolutely kind of come to that conclusion. So, if you hear a new vendor come along and say they're an LXP, what that means is they frankly don't understand the market.
Okay, there we go. I'm going to come to your question, Jeff, about convergence of the segments in a second, but I'm going to switch actually to a more general question about the 9-grid, David. Simon has asked, can you talk about relative position within each zone? I guess this is a trajectory question.
Yeah, so first of all, the zones are, so all of our ratings are banded, so effectively a high, mid, low rating. And high in what the boundary points between those will be different each year because it's a banded structure. That determines ultimately which zone you're in, so which of the 9 boxes, if you like, of the 9 grid, and each of the zone has a name. The position within the zone, and this is really, really important, they are not relative to each other. So a vendor's trajectory, their position in a zone is relative to themselves and the market as a whole. And what I mean by relative to themselves is, are they accelerating or decelerating the market relative to their prior performance? So that might determine whether they're left or right side. Are they accelerating or decelerating in terms of the potential of what they offer? There's loads of innovation in the market. There's been massive investments, obviously, around AI. And so a vendor that can have quite a big roadmap of stuff that they're doing and actually still be falling behind. So the position within a zone is not relative to the other vendors. It's relative to their own relative change in performance, the delta on potential and performance, and they all have names. So top right within a zone we call excelling, because that means basically they're accelerating their performance and potential within that zone. Somebody who on the right side is accelerating, in other words, their performance is accelerating, but not necessarily their potential is being maintained. And the middle one is called maintaining, right? So they are tracking against the market. What that means is, because for example, the functional assessment is zero-based each year, average, even though market average is 100%, the actual total functional capability you have to be average is different from year to year, and actually gets harder and harder and harder. So yeah, the position in a zone is relative to their own trajectory, and as I said, that's measured against themselves and the market as a whole. So for example, as Fiona said, for example, the market's still growing, but that growth has slowed down. So if you're growing faster than that, then obviously that number that you need to grow faster than that to be relatively growing in terms of market share is lower than it used to be, right? And that's where you kind of start to see things. The only thing that can sometimes confuse things a little bit is when somebody moves up. So they move up from the bottom band, for example, into the core things, or from core and strategic, because quite often what you'll do is you'll see them go left first and then before they go right. It's very hard to go, for example, from core leader to strategic leader. You nearly always go via strategic challenger. So yeah, position in the thing is not relative to each other. This is one of the things that gets confused, and somebody can be in the same position for very different reasons. And we often see that, unfortunately, because there's too many vendors and only a finite number of places, you will see situations. So for example, where B-Link and 360 Learning are in there, and sometimes the vendors themselves are like, well, how can this possibly be? But actually, there is a very strong underlying logic as to why that is. But they may be evidencing different things. One might be there because of customer satisfaction, acceleration, and advocacy. Another one might be there because they're just growing really quickly. So,
thanks, David. Just under 10 minutes to go. Keep your questions coming in. Jeff asks, Regarding convergence of the 9 grids, or should we say segments, do you see all these functionalities merging in a single platform, Fiona, or an ecosystem with multiple best-in-class vendors?
So a lot of the, as I said, a lot of the learning systems now do have their own libraries, and or as part of their organization, they have instructional designers, and they have, so that it's maybe not as much as the authoring side. And when I say authoring, it's the content creation piece. It's not necessarily a sophisticated tool like the Adobe tools, the Articulate, etc. But it more and more, some of the learning systems vendors are creating their own tools that they're selling separately, almost as a leader into an organization. They'll sell, an authoring tool and then follow up with a learning system. Others, it's very much part of the learning system itself. I mean, actually, 360 Learning, for example, when they set up years ago, it was all about the authoring for SMEs, subject matter experts, to create content for their peers, to kind of release, if you like, the pressure from L&D departments that needed, they might have 3 or 6 months pipeline of content that they were creating back then. And so there was that need of being able to create something. And so that would be provided within the learning system itself. So actually, there are quite a number I won't go through all of them, but there are a number on the grid that have its learning system plus content libraries, and also the authoring tool. Actually, just to mention that both Degreed and I think it is StudyTube have literally in the last couple of years taken AI and developed their own libraries to undercut a lot of the bigger libraries that are out there. So yeah, it is definitely all coming under one roof.
There's another version of this conversation. We're having that within learning systems, but there's a more macro view of it. The same question gets asked within the HR vendors, right? So why do I need a learning system at all? Why don't I just use the HR module from my HR vendor, learning module from my HR vendor, and so on? And there is always pressure. I mean, particularly in economically challenging time, to consolidate and reduce the number of systems you need, the number and the overheads around those. As I said, particularly in large companies, the overheads around running multiple systems and integrating them together is not insignificant. The comment I'm going to make is the more that something feels like it's what's the word, lower value within the overall decision point, the more that just buying it from a single source makes sense. So one of the comments or answers we sometimes give about this in the HR ecosystem rather than just in learning is just like, when is good enough, right? When you're looking at the library of your LMS vendor or your authoring tool from your LMS vendor versus your learning system vendor versus your buying a dedicated platform. And the answer is generally when you don't want to be best. If you want to be best at that, then you typically go and buy something specialist and fit for purpose for it. But I think particularly in terms of content libraries, obviously what we're seeing is quite a lot of challenge. You'll see some of this when you look at the digital learning 9 grid when that comes out in the near future. Obviously there's a lot of pressure around budgets. Many people have multiple content libraries and are looking to try and simplify that and get better value for money. And then you've got AI coming along, potentially replacing the need for an awful lot of it, or enable you to self-generate almost your own content libraries, which is what some of the vendors have been doing, so that they can offer an undercut thing. So there's a lot of this is around the economic case, and as I said, the bits where is when is good enough generally when you don't need to be best, and if you want to be best, then you typically are still going to work with a specialist in that space.
Thanks, David. We have about 4 or 5 minutes to go. Time for a couple more questions. Looks like Simon's trajectory question is solved. One just come in from Pim, I'm going to ask this one. What impact do customer volume have on a vendor's relative position in the grid? What is the underlying weighting model for repositioning within the 9 grid? David, I'll come to you first on that as well.
So when we're looking at the vendor assessment, one of the things we're tracking is basically the number of customers and the number of users, and also the demographic, if you like, the profile of those customers. Do they have lots of small customers? Do they have lots of big customers? You know, what is their main target space? And some of the boundaries are a bit porous. So we say this is aimed at enterprise organizations, which typically means 1,000 employees upwards, you know, for somebody buying for those kind of companies. But the reality is most of the vendors at the bottom end will talk to you about 250 to 2,500 or 300 to 3,000 or something as their typical customer profile. There also, the other factor is there are quite a few systems that have been in use which are used by customers or because of they use them for one particular piece, but they're not used for the whole enterprise. And that's also a big kind of part of the calculation as well. So, excuse me, we definitely look at customer size and as well as the turnover of the company and their things to determine presence. That's basically the size of the bubble, if you like, in terms of the market. We're looking at win rate, you know, presence in. We're looking at how often they're in consideration, how often they win, and how well they execute, and what the customer advocacy is like when we're looking at the performance. That's the left to right rating. And then when we're assessing potential, what we're looking at is their ability to solve the needs of an increasingly large and more complex customer. So you know, as you move up the 9 grid, you have to be able to evidence that success with very large organizations. So there are quite a lot of, for example, the core leaders, which will have large enterprise customers and therefore could in some cases be a strategic challenger, right? But actually that's not consistently where they play. Or sometimes they are good at winning, but only in part of that business. And the moment it comes to, this is a conversation we quite often have with the vendors as well, the moment it becomes down to who's in consideration for the whole of the company, for the business, many of those don't even get a look in. So you've got to think about all of those factors being in there. And as I said, you know, customer performance and advocacy, I said this right up front before we even got to this point, is a huge part of it. So we've got in the past and in some of the 9 grids, you'll see companies that have had a very high profile in the market, have got a large number of customers, but if most of those customers are struggling or don't like them or are looking to replace them, then that pushes their rate, can push not just their trajectory left, but them across into other zones as well. So all of those factors are really important with us in the underlying model. Ultimately, obviously, we have to put all of these factors together. It's quite complicated, but there's a very robust process behind it, as well as, of course, a peer review process and so on within Fosway. So yeah, I'm happy to go, you know, offline into the more detail about it, but this is actually really an important thing. We're trying to work out who best serves what part of the market and how well they are really performing and their ability, you know, and their potential to increasingly serve that better. Which is why I said, as you step up from lower to mid to hard top band, actually the problem gets exponentially more complicated. It's not just doing the same thing with a slightly larger organization, because the organizations themselves typically get a lot more diverse and more complicated.
And I think we find as well, David, if an organization, if a vendor is actually growing really quickly, then if they don't have their customer success management teams growing at the same rate, then that's when we start to hear from customers that maybe the support is a little bit delayed, or they don't feel as though they're actually getting the support they need. And so as some vendors in a year or two might be really sort of top right in a zone, could actually move backwards if they haven't invested in that customer success side of things. We certainly saw that a few years ago with some of the bigger players.
And we do in every 9 grid. You can see this trajectory wobble sometimes where you get companies go left from where they were. So
Thanks both. Okay, I think that's it for questions. Thanks to everybody for all your questions in the chat. Thank you. We're going to move on to the last couple of slides and let's talk quickly about the strategic AI research project, David, and everything that's going on there.
Yeah, so Fiona referred to this earlier on, and I think it's if we probably should have had a slide that actually showed a graphic of this, etc. Last year, we put out a thing which we called the AI market assessment. So for each of the segments we cover, we've been running parallel research for the last 12 months, where we are looking at basically the AI specifically as a strategic area on its own right, as well as obviously looking at how it plays within the 9 grid assessment. So there's a lot of AI stuff embedded in that. We actually produced a thing called the AI market assessment for learning systems, which was published in July, which looks at the kind of AI innovation, in particularly the roadmaps of vendors versus the live reality. Some of that led to some of the headlines that Fiona talked about before. But we're in the process of updating that as well, and that's due to be published very soon, like hopefully within the next week or so. For the updated thing, but we've also got a second part of that project. So every time we talk to everybody, and please go and have a look at it because there's a load of very unique content in it. But actually, obviously, the question everybody wants to know is anybody using this? So there's a two-stage process running this year for each of the segments. So the first part is looking at the roadmaps and market innovation. The second part is looking at adoption and value. So this slide was originally kind of about, we've actually running a project. If you're a corporate and interested in understanding, what's real in the AI, how much different, how good your vendors are, what differentiates them, what you should be doing around adoption and so on and things like this. There is a specific we're looking for companies to participate in that research process, and Jack's email is on here as well. So if you email him, I mean, he can provide more information about that project. But the market assessment for 2026 will be coming very soon. Last year, as I said, it was July. This year, we're going to be definitely publishing it within, hopefully in the next week. I'm doing the final edit on the paper now, and you'll see the similar things come for the others. And then in the next, 3 to 4 months, also looking at this adoption and value, because it's such a huge thing going on in the market, but there is just this wall of noise. Understanding what's real and what isn't and how you approach it is really important. So this is separate but relates to the 9 grid as well. So obviously we use some of this information as part of the 9 grid process, but there's it's something that has a lot of value. If specifically you're looking at AI, then I would certainly say you should be looking to both not just read the research but potentially participate in it. We're also running virtual roundtables around it, and we're actually going to be running an AI and learning symposium event. So again, for corporates that are interested in that, potentially attending that in London in May. There are some places that potentially will be available at that as well, but that's very much a small group, high quality audience, specifically discussing, how they're really adopting AI and learning.
Great stuff. Thank you, David. Okay, just a couple more slides. Remember, the 9 grid is just the start. We mentioned corporate membership before. There's also Fosway's accelerated buying support to align stakeholders, validate solution strategy, shortlist vendor options, and accelerate and de-risk your buying decisions. There are also some resources coming up on the next slide as well. There is, of course, the 9 grid for learning systems, as well as our other 4 segments: cloud HR, talent people success, digital learning, and talent acquisition. The Fosway Knowledge Centre is where all these things are gathered together, along with realities, all our insights, all our papers, everything like that. So do check out the Knowledge Centre. And that is it. It remains for me to thank both of our speakers today, David and Fiona, for their time, and thank all of you for tuning in. We will see you on the next one, which is going to be 23rd of April for the 9 grid for digital learning. Hope to see you all then. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.